This is Lisa from Mobile Tech Review, and oh boy, it's the Razer Blade 15 again, or Razer Blade Advanced, as it's now called, because last year in 2018 they came out with a lower end model, and they called the existing model the advanced model. So for 2019, this is the new advanced model, and what's changed? Pretty much NVIDIA RTX graphics. So that's the latest generation, just refreshed from NVIDIA, and you have your choice this time of the NVIDIA RTX 2060, the 2070 Max-Q, and the 2080 Max-Q. The 2080 is a new thing. Last generation, they never went up to the 1080 Max-Q. The 1070 Max-Q was as high as they went. And the reason they can do that now is because NVIDIA's thermals have gotten a little bit better. So on average, the GPUs are consuming about 10 watts less. Gives them a little bit more headroom there. We're going to talk more about the performance and the cooling, though. The chassis on this is pretty much unchanged, which is not a bad thing. This is aluminum unibody. It is dense like a brick. It's not really very heavy. You can see the weight on screen. Slightly heavier if you go for the 2070 and 2080 versus the 2060 model, but it's always sort of like a computer work of art, or the black MacBook Pro, if you will. It has gotten about a ½ millimeter thicker, which, believe me, we'll show you the old and the new one side by side. You really won't be able to tell the difference, and that's to allow for a little bit more cooling room, which is a good thing, because these super thin and light gaming laptops with RTX graphics inside, man, they are running hot, right? As you know, even from the previous generation GTX. We're going to look at it now. So the chassis stays the same. The two currently available display options are the same right down to the panel. You can get a full HD matte 144 Hz display, and that's an LG display, same exact panel models last year, and the 4K UHD touchscreen, which is 100% of Adobe RGB versus 75% for the full HD model. Again, same panel as last year. What is kind of exciting, maybe coming in Q2 of 2019, is an OLED display option. Oh, yummy, very nice. And also, they're working on a 240 Hz refresh display. If you thought 144 wasn't fast enough, honestly, I think that that's kind of just to say we did it marketing-wise. Who needs 240 Hz refresh rate on screen? That's going a little crazy. But I leave that up to you. You might want it. Anyway, they'll make it available. They've added a Windows Hello IR camera for facial recognition login. That's a nice welcome change. And Razer Synapse 3, which is a control center software that controls the machine, has a new creator setting. Before, we had the regular standard balanced mode, and we had the gaming mode, which clocks up the GPU a little bit. So creator mode clocks up CPU a little bit. That change might actually come to the last generation model too. I don't know. It's a small thing. And you've got the same Intel Core i7-8750H CPU as we have with the last generation, 6-core, 45-watt, typical gaming laptop and mobile workstation laptop CPU inside. Same memory configuration. It comes with 16 gigs of DDR4 2666 megahertz dual channel RAM, so that means two 8-gig modules. If you want to upgrade, you're probably going to toss those away and get yourself two 16s if you want more memory. The max on this is 64 gigs using two 32-gig modules, which are pretty hard to find and pretty expensive right now. An NVMe SSD is standard. Some configurations start with a 512 gigs. Some of them offer a 256 gig option. Ours is the fast Samsung PM981 SSD, which is pretty much the fastest SSD on the market right now. Razer Chroma is here as ever per key RGB backlighting, and it gets really bright. I find it a little hard on the eyes when it's set to max brightness, and it is actually a keyboard with PWM refresh, not the display, but the keyboard, so I actually can notice that, whereas the displays, when they have PWM, usually I can't even tell. This display doesn't have PWM, by the way. Another new thing, finally, they have backlit the multimedia keys, so no more having to color code your volume up, volume down, brightness up, brightness down, whatever it is that you typically look for all the time because you couldn't find it because it wasn't backlit in a dark room. The keyboard itself is the same, and that's not the greatest news in the world to me because it's a very low travel, not much tactile feedback kind of keyboard. There are some that can do 1.2 millimeters of travel and feel fairly usable, like a Dell XPS 15. This one just feels like nothing when you're typing, so I make more typos with this one. And I own the last generation NVIDIA GTX 1070 Max-Q model, so I've been living with it for a year. I'm still not loving it. The Microsoft Precision Trackpad, on the other hand, that I love. It's very good trackpad, wonderful experience, and pretty large too. And now you can get it in Mercury White. That's going to cost you $50 more. So if that really very pretty inky black, matte black finish that does pick up fingerprints isn't your thing, you can get it in Mercury White. If you get the black one, you are going to get that Razer green logo on the back. So if you have to be ultra chill, get yourself a skin. As ever, this is an expensive proposition. It starts at $22.99, call it $2,300, and that is for your RTX 2060 model with a 512 gig SSD and the full HD display. If you want to go up to the 4K display, right now that one's getting paired with only the RTX 2070 Max-Q version for some reason, but that's $200 more. You can go up to $3,000 and get the model that we have, which has a 512 gig SSD and the RTX 2080 Max-Q graphics inside, and still a full HD display. So yes, you could, in theory, if they make the 4K display available for that RTX 2080 model or the OLED in the future, you could go over $3,000. If you want more than a 512 gig SSD, you're going to have to put it in yourself, which happily isn't the hardest thing to do with this. Pretty much you unscrew the bottom, open it up, and there's your M.2 SSD slot, of which there is one. We have Thunderbolt 3 on board, just like we did last year, so if you wanted to use Razer's own core and an external GPU with this, you could do that, or a dock, you know, you get the idea. And of course, it's USB-C as well. So how about performance and cooling? That's probably what you really care about with a gaming laptop. And last year's Razer Blade 15 Advanced model really did quite well, given how thin it is. And less room for cooling means less heat, typically. Now, the 2060 starting model, you might be tempted by that because here's how it works with RTXs. We have a little card you can look at on screen. The Max-Q typically performs like one card lower in the full version GPU. So that means if you get an RTX 2070 Max-Q, in some benchmarks and games, the full RTX 2060 may perform about the same. So you might say, oh, I should get that. And maybe you should and save a little bit of money, but a few things to keep in mind, as is always the case. If you're getting the 2060, you're only getting 6 gigs of DDR6 VRAM. If you go with the 2070 Max-Q, or of course the 2080, you're getting 8 gigs, so more for textures on screen. Games like GTA 5 like to have more video memory. The other thing is ray tracing, which right now isn't so much of a thing. We have 3 games that nominally support it, really more like 2. But the list should grow to 18 pretty quickly. So if you want the ray tracing feature, you get more gigaраys per second supported if you go with the 2070 versus the 2060. All right, now we got that out of the way. The CPU performance is just like last year's because it is the same CPU as last year. The cooling has been beefed up a little bit. We're still using vapor chamber cooling here, which is a good thing, and it's pretty darn effective, and they're using graphite thermal paste. So if you watched my last year's review, you know that I actually tried repasting it with a conventional paste like Icy Diamond 7, which is a good quality paste, and the thermals didn't really change much. So the same should be true here again, unless you go crazy and you want to use something like liquid metal. The GPU on this, still the temperatures are pretty good. NVIDIA is really very good at controlling that. The CPUs have generally been the problem child when it comes to heat. So we have the RTX 2080 Max-Q, so that's going to be the hottest knife in the drawer, so to speak. And GPU temperatures are still typically around 75 to sometimes 80 degrees centigrade, which is pretty darn chill when you're talking about 100 centigrade allowable. Not a problem. The CPU cores indeed are a little hotter than they were in last year's GTX 1070 model, which again is the one that I have, which makes sense because you've got a little bit of a hotter GPU paired inside and very little room for cooling here. So here's my recommendation. If you're playing games, you might be tempted to use the gaming mode. If you're playing a cutting-edge title like Far Cry 5 or Shadow of the Tomb Raider, anything pretty recent and pretty demanding, I suggest you stick with the regular balance mode inside of Razer Synapse because that will drop your core temperatures to upper 80s to 91, 92 centigrade, which is toasty, but it's not as scary as when it's in gaming mode, and I'm seeing it hit 96, 98 centigrade. Again, 100 is the max allowable, so it's a little toasty. Obviously, if you go with the 2070 or the 2060, you're probably going to have lower temperatures overall, and you might be able to use gaming mode without seeing these alarming temperatures. Fan noise seems a little quieter than last year. Probably they're optimizing the fan design, and that's the reason why. It's not a huge difference. This is a gaming laptop. When you're gaming, you will hear the fans. It's been years since Razer had annoying fans. This is not like the Razer Blade 14. And it's a lot of air moving. It's a big whoosh going on, but that's about it. And every thin and light gaming laptop is going to have plenty of whoosh going on when you're gaming. So how about compared to last year's model for the Razer Blade or for any model with a GTX versus an RTX? What I'm seeing is, typically speaking, a 10 to 15% performance improvement, not including ray tracing and the benefits of DLSS that we'll see going ahead later in the year. For now, those don't make as much of a difference, do they? So basically what that means, you're jumping up a tier kind of in the 1060 to 1070 to 1080 thing. If you had a last year's GTX 1070 Max Q, the GTX 2070 Max Q will perform like our GTX 1080. Get it? So a 2070 performs like last year's 1080. So that's a nice performance jump. And as I said when I reviewed the Gigabyte Aero 15, yeah, with Pascal, with the last generation of GTX graphics, NVIDIA made a huge leap in performance, and they just can't do that every generation. So this one is not a huge leap, but that's not cheap Cheetos either. It's like getting a free upgrade from the 2070 to the 2080, basically. Now, for those of you who are thinking about, if I can still find last year's model somewhere, should I get last year's model? Again, it really, if you can save $500 and you're not really worried too much about ray tracing looking a little prettier, or DLSS actually reducing temperatures and the performance demand of the GPU, because it's a pretty efficient way of sharpening up things on the screen, then sure, 10 to 15% performance leap, not discounting the importance of DLSS in the future. Yeah, it could be worth it. Now, compared to other laptops, we're going to be reviewing a lot of these Max-Q thin and light gaming laptops. The MSI GS65 Stealth Thin is one of the ones that's on the plate coming soon. And that one has almost as classy a look to it, a little bit more flexy, but still good. The Gigabyte Aero 15 that I just reviewed isn't pushing the performance as much. This is what you get with Razer. They're a gaming company. They really push performance on this. So the GPU clocks on this, for example, with Max-Q typically are clocked pretty low, but this one, the base clock on it, as you can see on screen, is pretty good for a Max-Q. And when you're gaming, it really pushes it high. And I'm impressed at how far they're pushing the performance on this, which does explain the fact that it does get pretty hot internally. Externally, the temperatures are hot. They were last generation too, but up to 50 degrees centigrade, which I always say is a great temperature to steep green tea at, but not something I want against my skin, ever. So put it on a desk, put it on a laptop cooler, you get the idea. For the top surface temperatures, not as much of a concern. Where the heat is on the top is above the keyboard, so you don't touch there anyway. The keyboard and the palm rest are always warm, not hot, even when gaming, just warm. In the winter, it feels great. In the summer, it's not enough to make your hands sweat, but then again, I have frosty fingers. Battery life. Well, first, here's the 230-watt charger. It's a nice-looking charger. What more can you say? It has a little cloth cover on it, the Leather Daddy man bracelet to keep it all tidy, and it does not buzz. Last year, Razer had a problem with the very first Razer Blade 15 chargers buzzing. In fact, I got mine replaced under warranty. No buzzing here. We still have the same 80-watt-hour battery that we had in last year's model, which is a decent capacity battery. It's not as high as, say, the Dell XPS 15, but that one has more room for battery because it has a smaller GPU inside. Battery life has gotten about a half an hour better from the previous generation model, and that's probably due to the efficiencies of the system as they've designed it, and a bit probably when the RTX gets called on using NVIDIA Optimus every so often, it doesn't use as much power when it does, and does a better job of staying off when it should stay off. So for doing things like productivity, streaming some video on Netflix or Amazon Prime, doing a little bit of Photoshop photo editing, it's about 6.5 hours for the battery life versus 6 hours for last year's model. So for a thin and light gaming laptop, that's pretty good. And that's at brightness set at 150 nits. If you were obviously going to lower the brightness some more and use a more power-conserving setting instead of the balanced mode for performance, then you could probably squeeze more battery life out of it. So it's decent. Again, just like last year's model, taking off the bottom is really easy. Unscrew the Torx T5 screws, it pops right off. No annoying clips to fight with or anything like that. We have the same elevated rubber strips here that allow a little air to get in on the bottom, because that's where it intakes air, is from the bottom, right over here and right there. So there's our two fans. Here's our two RAM slots, just like last year. Here's our display cable still running across the heat sink, and I guess that hasn't been a problem, has it? Because mine's still working after a year, and other people seem to be as well. Here's our M.2 SSD slot, and interestingly enough, they didn't put any thermal pads on here to keep this cool, but it is running cooler, I think because they've redesigned the airflow just a little bit so that the poor thing isn't getting as hot as it did last year. Even our PCH is under a little bit of copper heatsink here, and boy, is that one polished copper heatsink here. So they did away with the black paint on the heatsink last year, mid-revision. And here is our Intel 9560 AC Wi-Fi card, and these are the backside of our stereo speakers that fire up toward the keyboard area, so that's good. It fires at you, not at the desk. And they sound exactly the same as last year, which is to say, decent, not a whole lot of bass, not a super lot of volume. If you're playing games, you're probably going to want headphones. Not that the fans are that loud, but the speakers aren't super duper loud. But they're decent quality in terms of dynamic range and that sort of thing. Heat exits out the back, and there's vents all along the back ridge. Again, it's the same as last year's model. So just like last year's model, I like this one a lot. I mean, the build quality on this is impeccable. The way it's put together, the looks are very mature and very nice and very classy. The display options on this are excellent. I can only imagine what the OLED one's going to look like. Chroma RGB lighting, a keyboard I don't like the tactile feel of so much. Oh well. One of the things I really like these thin and light gaming laptops for, especially the ones that are more mature looking, is the fact that they're great for content creation. For those of you who are thinking about a 15-inch MacBook Pro, for example, but are looking for more performance, this sort of laptop is fantastic. And you have the benefit of being able to do some real serious gaming with it. If I was going to buy this as a dedicated gaming laptop, this is the same for all the thin and light, really thin and light gaming laptops. I would prefer to get something with a bigger chassis, just because the thermals would be better. I wouldn't be worrying so much about the CPU particularly getting so hot, or the battery getting a little swollen from the heat inside. It's not anything on Razer, it's just that this genre of laptop, you just have to keep that in mind if you're looking for something that you're going to game, if you're lucky enough to have the time, for 4 hours a day, every day, or something like that. But overall, this is still, generally speaking, the one to beat. I'm Lisa from Mobile Tech Review. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more cool tech videos, and thumbs up if you like this vid.